nerds. So, I'm going to continue my series on John Caputo's book on Heidegger and Aquinas on metaphysics. So, remember, John Caputo is a postmodern Christian, evil postmodern Christian. He wrote Heidegger and Aquinas, an essay on metaphysics. Now, remember, metaphysics is the philosophical study and speculation about the cosmic nature, structure, and function of the universe. It gets into abstract concepts like the nature of God, being, substance, time, space, and epistemology or knowledge. I've mentioned Heidegger many times previously. He was a 20th century philosopher who studied phenomenology and metaphysics. Phenomenology is essentially the study of our first person experience of consciousness. So, Thomas Aquinas was the 13th century Catholic scholastic theologian and priest who founded his own theology called Thomism, in which he outlined his conception of metaphysics. So Heidegger, in this paragraph in the book that I'll get into, he gets into the medieval scholastic phase of metaphysics, and that's what he investigates some himself, and he devoted an entire book to that as well. So I'll have to explain who Kant is too. In my series I've been doing on the Cambridge Companion to Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, Kant, who is the famous 1700s Enlightenment philosopher's views on metaphysics, are explained. Kant had an on-again, off-again relationship with metaphysics, and I explain what metaphysics is. So Kant kind of had a hard-on for his grand philosophical system that supposedly tells us the true nature of the structure and the function of the universe. He claimed to have found his universally accepted standard for human knowledge. I should just say knowledge, not human knowledge necessarily. Kant retconned his previous, at some point, Kant retconned his previous brutal takedown of metaphysics and said that it was merely necessary skepticism for making his philosophical system work. Kant decided that the foundation of his metaphysics was morality. He just needed a method. He wanted to determine the proper ends and limits of human desires and power, but he still hadn't found his method. So, he sketched out what he called the science of the limits of human reason. And can he find the method for his metaphysics of morals that will show us the science of the limits of human reason, power, and desire? We'll see. And we're also going to have to define transcendentalism here, because it gets into that in the paragraph as well. So remember, I explained this in my series on Slavoj Žižek's book, my favorite Hegelian / Lacanian / Marxist philosopher. I've been doing a series on his book called Less Than Nothing, and he talks about Kant a lot in there. And this is Kant's idea of transcendental philosophy. Kant's transcendental philosophy is the position that ideas exist independent of human observation. Each idea, like knowledge and others, can be considered things in themselves or noumenons. In transcendental philosophy, ideas as things in themselves are independent of human experience. It's impossible to even observe them. Ideas are transcendental, not transcendent. This isn't the famous ancient Greek philosopher Plato's realm of forms or realm of ideas, in which ideas are transcendent. To Kant, ideas are transcendental rather than transcendent. Remember that to Plato, transcendence means above regular human experience. So ideas are beyond human experience if they're transcendent. Kant goes even farther than that. Ideas are not only eternal and above human perception, ideas are totally inaccessible. To Plato, it's possible to discover the most ideal or pure form of an idea like beauty. To Kant, flawless beauty cannot be discovered. It exists completely independently of human observation. We cannot possibly perceive true divine beauty. We can only observe more minor forms of true beauty. So I'll need to explain naive realism a little bit too here. So naive realism has different definitions in philosophy and psychology. It has an interesting, slightly different definition in psychology, but in philosophy, it's naive realism is the idea that our senses provide us with direct awareness of objects as they are. it's often contrasted with indirect realism. So this reminds me of John Locke. Remember the famous 17th century British empiricist Enlightenment philosopher? And he was like one of the most seminal figures in empiricism, like to oversimplify, meaning that we learn all of our knowledge about reality through our senses, which, so naive realism to me is kind of like empiricism on steroids, like you're gaining objective knowledge about the universe through your senses. And in empiricism you're learning about that, but you're not necessarily learning objectively correct information that is like undeniably correct. So that's why it's naive realism. Like I said, it's like empiricism on steroids, or our senses convey 100% objective information to us with in terms of accuracy about the nature of the world. Okay, so with that all in mind, let's get into the paragraph here. So Heidegger's talking about scholasticism and transcendental philosophy. So remember, Kantian transcendental philosophy. And we could replace scholasticism with just, academics, although scholasticism is a more specific type of thing, but it's not that big of a deal, I don't think. Anyway, Heidegger's first steps as a philosopher were taken in the shadows of two strong and competing isms, the transcendental philosophy of neo-Kantianism. So remember, transcendentalism, the idea that, like to oversimplify, that ideas are completely inaccessible. They're like more transcendent than transcendent in neo-Kantianism. So the transcendentalist philosophy in all the neo-Kantian medieval theologians. So these medieval theologians became Kantians, and they developed their theology using Kant's transcendental philosophy. So neo-Kantianism reigned supreme in Germany, and neo-scholasticism. So those are the two isms, neo-Kantianism and neo-scholasticism. And I don't need to get through all of this, but Heidegger was a Catholic seminarian, and he was exposed to both influences, neo-Kantianism and neo-scholasticism. And he was basically a student of seminal figures in both neo-Kantianism and neo-scholasticism. And one of them was a medievalist who argued against psychologism from a scholastic standpoint. We don't need to get into psychologism, but it's a specific thing that they were all studying. On the other side, there's okay, so there he learned from Geyser and Rickert. We don't really need to get into who those people are. Okay, and one of them only taught Heidegger because he was supposedly a Catholic, although he was raised as a Catholic and he was going to school to be a Jesuit priest, but then later on he kind of became more of a Protestant, which is, or at least was comparing Protestantism and Catholicism in his like theology or whatever you would call it. So as we see in these early writings, we see Heidegger struggling to balance the claims of metaphysical and realistically oriented scholasticism with the insights of the transcendental standpoint. So you're trying to reconcile scholasticism with neo-Kantianism in terms of transcendentalism. So the idea that ideas are inaccessible and more transcendent than transcendent, make that work with medieval scholastic philosophy. So it is, although it is a bit aphoristic to say so, one can view Being and Time, which is, of course, Heidegger's most famous work, as not an unimportant way the outcome of this conflict. With the scholastics, Heidegger rejects the absorption. So this is what he gets into. So we can absorption of reality into consciousness, or idealism. So we can talk about naive realism versus idealism in terms of transcendentalism. Wait, well, no, not naive realism. Naive realism is like the opposite of transcendentalism, really. So the scholastics were idealists, basically. The absorption of reality into consciousness, like it's not panpsychism, but the idea that it's not exactly the idea that reality is conscious, but it's the idea that consciousness is not material. It's kind of more like that in terms of whether we're talking about whether conscious is material or immaterial, like we were talking about in terms of that video with Alex O'Connor and the philosophy of consciousness. So anyway, with the transcendental thinkers in the neo-Kantian, so in this intellectual war between the scholastics and the neo-Kantians, he rejected the scholastics the scholastics' idealism, and he rejected the neo-Kantians' transcendentalism. So he rejected the idea that reality is absorbed into consciousness, and he rejects the idea that reality is absorbed into consciousness. He rejects transcendentalism, which means that he rejects the idea that ideas are more transcendent than transcendent and inaccessible. And he also rejects naive realism, the idea that, like, to oversimplify, we can gain objective knowledge about reality. So he believes that reality is not reality is not conscious. We can't gain objective information about reality through our senses, and we can't totally understand ideas. So basically, he's rejecting all these different ways of thinking. So, and with both movements, meaning both movements, scholasticism and neo-Kantianism, he rejects psychologism, which had the combined wrath of both scholasticism and neo-Kantianism called down upon itself. So none of them like psychologism, basically. Heidegger wants to affirm reality while at the same time giving an account of the subjective life in which reality is reached. That's pretty challenging, given his criticisms of idealism, naive realism, and transcendentalism, right? He's trying to he's rejecting but also trying to reconcile scholasticism and neo-Kantianism. So, like I said, he's trying to affirm affirm reality while at the same time giving an account of the subjective life in which reality is reached. So he wants to learn about the objective nature of reality within the framework of our subjective points of view within objective reality. So that's like like a very complex and more realistic way of viewing reality. Although I think it's like more subjective, though not relativistic in terms of reality. But that's interesting. So he's trying to figure out the true nature of reality, but keep in mind our subjective perspective within objective reality. And he's trying to figure this out without the idea that reality is conscious, that we can learn objective nature of reality from our senses, and that ideas are inaccessible. So that means that we can access ideas. Reality is not, we are conscious, but ideas are not conscious, and we can access these ideas, but we can't learn objective nature about them. So it sounds like we can learn something about reality and we can learn something about ourselves, but we can't really learn. It sounds like almost impossible to learn the true nature of reality and ourselves, because you have to use subjective knowledge to learn objective facts and objective facts to learn subjective facts. And these are so different. But I think that the underlying point here is this, that Heidegger is so complex that he's comparing neo-Kantianism to scholasticism, and he's trying to mesh two different types of, like, one philosophical movement and one theological movement of thought together, while rejecting the central ideas of each movement. So he's trying to figure out the true nature of he's trying to figure out the true nature of our subjective experience in objective reality. Can he figure out the true subject can he figure out the true subjective can he figure out the true nature of our subjective experience in objective reality, without acknowledging that ideas are inaccessible, and without thinking that, so reality is not conscious, but we can access ideas, but we can't understand them objectively. So can we, or can we not then? Like it seems like with his objections, they're actually kind of he's actually kind of contradicting himself unless he comes up with some alternative ideas. So that's where he actually does get into some alternative ideas. So basically, Heidegger is trying to form his own even though he kind of rejects metaphysics, he also kind of forms his own metaphysics. Heidegger does in a way. So he's trying to combine philosophy and theology in order to create his own metaphysical system that rejects central aspects of both the theological and philosophical systems that he's working with. So Heidegger is working on forming his own metaphysical system by integrating Kant and religion in order to figure out the true nature of our subjective experience in objective reality. So yeah, Kant is trying to Kant is working now on forming his own metaphysical system that combines philosophy and theology in order for him to discover the true nature of our subjective experience within objective reality.